Sorry to step in front of you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Center for American Progress Action Fund. My name is Neera Tandon, and I'm president of CAP Action. I really want to have a lively discussion today, and the topic really is what is happening in American politics. I want to start off with just a few recent headlines. Michael Gerson, Trump's nomination would rip the heart out of the Republican Party. George Will, if Trump wins the nomination, prepare for the end of the Conservative Party. Eric Erickson, America, you're watching the beginning of the end of the Republican Party. Quite some existential panic there. And we also have disruption, a fair amount of disruption on the Democratic side as well, which we will get to. With the South Carolina primary just 2 days away on the Republican side, pundits and policymakers across the spectrum continue to debate what's really happening in our national discourse. How is it that Donald Trump has gained the traction that he has? And a few months ago, it was in December, right, David? You wrote a really incredible piece about titled "The Great Republican Revolt" for The Atlantic, which really analyzed why we have the rise of Donald Trump and what it means for the Republican Party. So I'd really like to just get into that. And so we're really honored to have David here. We also have two other panelists who have also discussed in great detail what's happening in American politics and also what's really happening to different demographic groups. Joan Welsh is the national affairs correspondent for The Nation and a political analyst for MSNBC. She's also the author of the book, What's the Matter with White People? Finding Our Own Way in the Next America, which really detailed what is happening with actually white voters, et cetera. We also have our very own senior fellow, Rui Teixeira, who's done extensive research on dramatic demographic shifts in America and recently authored The Path to 270 for this election. So I'm just going to kick it off and ask your broad takes. But first, David, I'd really love for you to just describe your piece in The Atlantic and really the thesis for the audience.
Well, the piece started with a joke I made in the men's room to one of the Atlantic editors. And it's a joke
as all great pieces do.
And it's a joke that actually, although you're neoliberals, there may be enough remembrance of Marxist terminology to understand. I said, "This what is going on?" He said, "What do you think is going on?" I said, "This is the year where the Republican base has moved from being a class in itself to a class for itself." Okay, we're exposing.
Yeah.
We're exposing.
Yeah.
So in Marxist theory, based on Hegelian theory before it, that you move from this moment where you have social classes that have common interests, the moment where they discover they have common interests, and they define their common interests in opposition to other classes that have other interests. That is sort of what has been happening here. I got a note in the summer of last year from the gateway keeper to one of the biggest Republican donors. Remember, Trump entered the race in June. In July, he moved into, first week in July, he moved into first place, and he stayed there through the summer of Trump, which has become the year of Trump. And my friend said this note, he said,
I think decade. Let's hope we have
decade of Trump, exactly, the 3 or 4 terms. And he said the party's going to split. And the party is going to split over this. And that was a note that was sent, I think, in August. What has been happening, the Republican Party has become the party of both the former members of the Roosevelt coalition and the former most intense opponents of the Roosevelt coalition. And it's an unstable project to keep them in the same place. And that project has become more unstable under the pressures of the Great Recession. The American economy has recovered. Most Americans' personal economies have not recovered. The typical household makes about $4,000 a year less than it did in 2007, and still less than the real peak, which was back in 1999. And meanwhile, the leadership of the Republican Party, which was surprised by the outcome in 2012, I was not. I wrote a book called Why Romney Lost that was published on the Thursday after the vote. And although I write fast, I don't write that fast. But they were surprised, and the conclusion they came to was change nothing. And the article is full of quotes that you mentioned in
Yeah.
the Atlantic, full of quotes from people. Change nothing, change nothing. We'll change one thing, which was the one thing about Romney's platform that the donors of the party had never liked anyway, and that was Romney's gestures toward tighter immigration enforcement. Jettison that. Marco Rubio followed that advice. Ted Cruz tiptoed up to the edge and then drew back. But at the time that Donald Trump entered the race, and then I will stop here, at the time that Donald Trump entered the race, Gallup did a poll that asked Republicans, what do you think should be done with unauthorized immigrants? And at that point, about 1/3 of Republicans, and gave them a stark set of choices, legalization or deportation. And about 1/3 of Republicans said, a little more, said legalization, but 60% said deportation. And at that point, all 17 candidates then in the race were sharing that same space with the minority answer, and nobody was taking the majority space of the deportation answer. And Donald Trump, one of America's great marketers, saw that opportunity, stepped into it, and ignited this explosion of rebellion among Republican voters who felt their party leadership just wasn't talking to or for them anymore.
So I guess I'd like to come back to immigration, and I'll pull everyone else in this, but I wanted to push on one thing, which is when I read your piece, obviously immigration is an issue you can see through an economic lens, which is your argument, as people are seeing it really through an economic lens. But I wanted to broaden out that debate a little bit, which is it's not just on immigration where Trump has defied the orthodoxy of the party. He's attacked Republican donors. He's definitely pushing an anti-establishment argument. But you argue in your piece that the kind of mainline Republicans have not been representing, or Washington Republicans have not been representing the economic interests of the Trump voters. So it would be great for you to tell me, who do you think the Trump voters are in terms of economic issues? And then where do you see that conflict in policy? And I'll come back to immigration in a second, beyond immigration.
I think American politics looks a lot like politics almost everywhere else in the developed world right now. And it's driven by three overwhelmingly deep forces. The first is the slowdown of economic growth since the year 2000. That means there's less wealth for all purposes, public and private, than people had expected would be there. The second is the aging of the population and the retirement of the baby boomers, which means there are more claims. There are more claims on disappointing wealth. And the third trend is intensifying forms of diversity, ethnic, cultural, religious. That means the claimants for wealth have less in common with each other and are more likely to be suspicious of each other. And that has driven politics all through the developed world. And what you see everywhere, in Britain, in France, in Italy, in Germany, have been the rise of anti-system politicians who speak for the interests of the older stock inhabitants of the country. And they defend existing social insurance programs. They oppose migration. They are suspicious of those parts of the state that don't serve the interests of the older stock populations. And sometimes these are forces that are drawn from the left, the way the Five-Star movement is in Italy. Sometimes they're drawn from the right, like the United Kingdom Independence Party. Sometimes they're neo-fascist, or have neo-fascist origins, like the National Front in France. Sometimes they have neo-communist origins, as often happens in Central and Eastern Europe. But they're saying the same thing. We want to protect our people, both from cultural change and from the global market, at a time when our people need government more and when government has less to give. One last point on this. There are a lot of things to say, but a point that really drives this point home. I cite in the article this sign that may or may not ever have been worn unironically. Keep the government's hands off my Medicare. That sign existed, but we're not sure it wasn't created by trollers. I don't know that it was ever worn by an authentic protester. But if it was not saying something stupid. Who else's hands are going to touch your Medicare, if not the government's? And when the Affordable Care Act was first unveiled, the concept was that Medicare would lose about $500 billion over 10 years, most of that from the Medicare Advantage program, in order to finance expansion of health coverage to the uninsured. 27% of the uninsured in 2010 were born outside the country. Doesn't mean they're here illegally or not citizens, but they had come from somewhere else, and these were the new claimants. And if you're a Medicare beneficiary who is much less well off at age 63 than at age 47 you thought you would be at 63, and you realize I'm going to need my Medicare, my Social Security more than I thought I would. And now a president who's culturally different from me, who comes from a big city, I come from a small town, he's got a foreign-born father. That this president who's so different from me, he is changing a program I need for the benefit of constituencies that are not like me.
But just to push on that, the Republican Party has been in, for whatever reasons, I'll just take that those are the reasons, the Republican Party has been in lockstep opposition to the ACA, right? So why, and every Republican running has opposed the ACA. So I guess I'm trying to get at why are Donald Trump voters angry at the party?
Well,
And others can join in too. You give your views and I'll come back.
I won't hog the mic here. I'll be very, because it is just, I mean, if you live in the Republican world, it's just overwhelmingly apparent that the party represents the interests of powerful and wealthy people. And there are some commonalities between the cultural concerns and the economic concerns of the rank and file and the concerns of the people who fund the party. But they're also in important ways different. And the cultural messaging, you saw that in the Romney campaign, the cult of the heroic entrepreneur. That's not who most people are. And God bless entrepreneurs, but most people aren't entrepreneurs. And by the way, 80% of entrepreneurs, as we know, fail. That's I mean, so there are a lot of ex-entrepreneurs out there who may not be as enchanted with that lifestyle.
I think they're called losers in the Donald Trump.
Well, I would prefer to call them people who haven't succeeded yet. But they, and I hope they will. But we know kidding. 4 out of 5 small businesses fail. But that language, and meanwhile, there were tremendous pressures on other kinds of programs. One more data point. I'm sorry to hog the mic. I think I cite this in the article. There are all kinds of studies of the attitudes of the baby boomers as they have gone through various age cohorts. And what we have seen with them, I should say white baby boomers, is that they have become, since 2007, dramatically more conservative. That if you look at the people born 15 years after World War II, 1945 to 1960, and the people born 1930 to 1945, the so-called silent generation, those people, the silents were much more conservative than the baby boomers until 2007, when suddenly the baby boomers caught up and became as conservative as the silents almost in a matter of months. And that had to do with the election of Barack Obama and the financial crisis arriving at the same time. But what did they mean by their conservatism? When you look at the attitudes of baby boomers in the 90s when they were younger and more liberal and ask them a question like, do you generally trust big business? They were more positive about business when they were more liberal and younger than they are now when they're older and more conservative. What they mean by conservatism is they want all the other programs on the ship tossed overboard to make sure that the programs they need are going to be protected. And in fact, baby boomers are more likely to say there should be no changes to Medicare than people who are older than them. People in their 60s are more defensive of Medicare exactly as it is than people in their 80s are.
Mm-hmm. So Jen, I'd love for you to respond. And really thought it was important to have your voice here because you've written extensively about white working class voters and their relationship with the New Deal and how that has weakened in some fundamental ways. But, you know, David makes the kind of important point. If you look at what Trump's saying about Medicare and Social Security, his message is to save them, not touch them. He differentiates himself from other Republicans on policies like that. He recently called for Medicare negotiating drug prices, a policy I agree with.
We all,
right.
Many of us agree with.
So many of us agree with. So I'd love to get your take on what you think is happening in response to David's many arguments.
David's many arguments are excellent. I have very little to quibble with, so I'm not going to start by quibbling. I think the really tough thing for as someone who wrote a book, What's the Matter with White People, David's piece ponders this also and finds this white working class base of the Republican Party profoundly anxious, profoundly afraid of the future, afraid of the multiracial future, but with a real economic basis for that fear.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, those of us who try to think about the evolution of the white working class from the FDR coalition to become Reagan Democrats to now become Trump Republicans, have to be rattled by it. And you know, I know people. We've talked about it. How can Democrats appeal to these voters? Can Democrats get these voters back? And I think it's a really important observation that David is making, and he's not alone in making it from the conservative side, but he doesn't have a lot of company, that this is a revolt against a Republican Party that has never really represented their interests. And that really, I mean, I've never heard it said before that it's the anti-Roosevelt coalition together with the Roosevelt coalition, but that's really profound. But as somebody who tries to tease out what we can learn that's, I don't know, positive, or what can help us move forward as we look at the Trump coalition, and can we address the underlying fears, economic fears that are there? I still come away every time we have these discussions about the white working class, how to tease out the racial reaction in it, you know, and the Republican Party, as much as I like Trump's kind of anti-austerity message, and I really look forward to him negotiating tough deals with the pharmaceutical companies when he's President Trump. I like a few of those things, but I'm much more kind of frightened and shaken by the racial attitudes that he represents. The Republican Party created Donald Trump in large measure because they all went and kissed his ring in 2012 when his only claim on political influence was that he had been the chief birther, confronting the president about his alleged, you know, foreign birth and his illegitimacy. And so I struggle all the time with how you detach that racial fear and animus from kind of positive populist impulses that even Democrats could be speaking to. And I look forward to more conversation with David about how that happens.
Yeah, so I want to follow up with Rui, and then we'll come back, and David, you can react. You know, if you look at kind of the two major issue conflagrations in the Republican side over the last 10 months or so, you know, the sort of economic debate was seen through an immigration lens, I mean, which Donald Trump really pushed. You know, his answer in almost every debate on economic issues and wages falling, you know, and the dealing with the fact that for white working class voters, they've seen, or white working class people in the United States, they've seen a real decline in income for 30 years. That is like a fact that we all have to deal with, and our economic policies have to deal with those better. But, you know, his response is an immigration response. And then I was taken when we started having a national security debate. It also moved to a racial issue, which is a position on banning Muslims from coming in. And so I think it's hard to, I want to push with you, Rui, on this particular point, which is how much is driving this is economic and how much of it is a reaction to the changing demographics in the country, the fact that we've all detailed that the country will become majority people of color in some time in the 2040s. If you look in many states, majority of children in schools are students of color. People using public schools are students of color. That's changing. How do we look at that? Because obviously on the Democratic side, there's also a class breakdown too, but it's not happening in racial. It doesn't, so far, it's not happening in a racial sense as far as we can decipher.
Yeah, well, just as a thought experiment, let's say that the same demographic trends were unfolding in the United States that we see today with the, you know, inexorable changes in the race ethnic composition of the population. You know, whites moving eventually toward minority status. It's true in the country. It's true in various states. Certain, you know, fair amount of immigration, at least in the past, which is also contributing to change. But let's say, as that was happening, we didn't see the economic trends that we've seen. Let's say the economic growth was much more robust, and let's say it was more equally distributed, and let's say the less skilled whites, who are really the ones, you know, sort of backing up the Trump coalition, let's say that they didn't do as badly as they have. Let's say that if they lost their jobs, they got other equivalent jobs that were pretty decent. Let's say there were good training programs or transition programs to move them from, say, if they lost a manufacturing job to some other jobs. Let's say their communities weren't declining the way that they are. Would we see the same reaction? My view would be absolutely not. Because I don't think you can separate the race component and the fear of the other from the anxiety that's produced and the fear that's produced by what the economic world has wrought for these kinds of voters in the last 20 to 25 years, and they look forward and they don't see things changing. That's why they're so furious at both parties, right? They don't like the Democrats because the Democrats are the party that kind of got us here, the big government, they're for the other. They, even when they've been in power, they still haven't solved my problems, even though they say they're going to. And, now I kind of like the Republicans for a while, but, it's not like they ever change anything either. It's not like my life is substantially different or better. And they're all in the pockets of the elites, of the big money people. I'm getting mad just thinking about it, right? So I think this is where they're coming from. But you can't separate their views that get connected to race and have something. It's almost a fundamental human fear of the other.
But so then,
but when it gets
thing.
connected to economic anxiety, it's a toxic combination.
Because Rui's question is actually not hypothetical. We actually have done this experiment, and it's called Canada. Where I spent half my time, and where I grew up. So Canada takes in a level of immigration that is actually relative to population somewhat higher than the United States.
It's a different economic mix than we do. But.
Well, I'll get. If you look at the years since 2000 and you compare to OECD countries, the American middle class has done about the worst in the OECD.
Yeah.
And the Canadian middle class has done about the best.
Best.
And the result is immigration is mildly controversial in Canada, but it's not explosively controversial. But there's one other difference, which is that Canada has not just more immigration, but a radically different immigration policy. The place where you are most likely to encounter an immigrant worker in Canada is in a hospital. That Canada and it's increasingly in small town Canada. If there's a GP there, that GP, the places that still have GPs and it's under pressure, but where there's a GP, that GP is certainly not born in Canada. So what immigration means is that your Timmins has doctors and dentists that it otherwise wouldn't have.
Competition for higher wage jobs.
Right. So one of my joke immigration reforms is the government should issue a green card to anybody for any job that pays over $300,000 a year. Let's expose the American elite to the bracing winds of competition, not just the people.
There was a Ted Cruz ad like that, I have to say.
But he's right. He's right, because what is the American immigration policy is it overwhelmingly chooses, both through who it admits and through who it doesn't consciously choose to admit, but who it allows to stay in and never takes any action to enforce laws against, to expose people at the bottom. But one more point about this is not just an economic matter. So I wrote a book in 2007, just before the crisis, and but seeing during the Bush years, a lot of these things were happening, but more slowly. And I wrote a book saying that Republicans were going to have trouble going into the election of 2008 because of what was happening to the middle class. And one of the things I hadn't done a lot of reporting for the book, but I mostly relied on data, but I did a little bit. In one of my trips, I spent some time in North Carolina at that point, was the state that relative to population had received the most migration in the Bush years. It didn't have such a hugely high level in the absolute, but in the relative terms. And so I met people who had experiences where in their medium-sized suburb, when their first child entered the first grade, there was not a single English second language student in the whole school. And by the time their third child completed sixth grade, a third of that child's class was English second language learners. And that has a colossal impact on your child's education, even if it doesn't affect your wages. It's extraordinary pressure. And it's something that is invisible here in Washington because, housing prices, where housing prices are very high, you're not going to, even in public schools, you're not going to see a lot of children of immigrant families, and they're going to be more likely to speak English if they do. But where housing prices are less, as they are in North Carolina, it's an intense exposure. And I
guess I want to push you. I think the push
Can I say one more sentence?
Oh, sure.
One more sentence also. But because Rui referred to the inexorable change, and there's a tendency to talk about immigration as if it's like the tides, but it's a policy. You can have more, you can have less. You can have some of some kind and some of other kinds. And the United States has chosen to have both a lot, to make sure that half of the stream is illegal and that it's looked the other way, and that it overwhelmingly arrives at the bottom of society, not at the top of society. Those
So
are
most
choices.
of the change in the race ethnic composition of the U.S. is going to be not from immigration. I mean, we could change
Going to
the
be from
policies tomorrow. It's
past
from
immigration.
fertility.
It's going to be second generation,
Yeah,
but it's
so-
a consequence of immigration choices. So I see the author of a book on the Immigration Act of '65 in the second row, and it's the knock-on effects of policy.
Right, but it's not that I mean, when you look at the changing demographics, just to clarify this, it's not, we're not assuming that the immigration level, the levels of immigration we've had into the country just keep going at that level. In fact, immigration has slowed down in the last few years.
Yeah, no, our assumptions are fairly modest about, I mean, yeah, we don't assume there'll be zero immigration, but
Yeah, so I think the thing I really wanted to push on this issue to maybe it's more at Rui, which is trying to, it's always hard to do these thought experiments, but I guess to me, I understand like looking at immigration in these terms from this perspective. I mean, I wouldn't do it myself, but I understand what the argument is. I guess what I find sort of surprising in the Republican debates is that is like the first, second, third, and fourth way in which the broad Republican debate is channeling an economic argument. And it's not about, I mean, Trump brings in forces like trade, but the debate has really all been about immigration. It could be about, you know, corporations not being fair to workers, or a whole range of issues, tax policy that really favors rich, or whatever the slew of issues. But it's that the fact that it's moved almost entirely to a racial debate, at least in one side of it so far. And, you know, of all the people expanding it, it's Trump. I mean, he brings in a few other issues. But that's why I think it's, you know, so many people are thinking it's definitely economic, but it's certainly racial. And it's hard to
right, well,
disaggregate.
they're selling this product, Trump is selling this product among a relatively small group of people. I mean, this is not a general election message. He's reaching 30 to 40% of the kind of people who vote in Republican primaries or show up at caucus or whatever. That's not a large group of people, but it's highly important for Republican politics, you know, in a presidential year. It's like where it's happening. So if you're trying to reach right populist whites, you know, skewing downscale in the Republican primary, this is a great strategy. But, you know, it doesn't mean that that's what's on the mind of the median voter in the United States. But it is on the mind of the median voter who's accessible to a populist candidate like Trump within the Republican primary universe. So I think those are two different things. And those are certainly the people for whom this kind of toxic combination of economic anxiety, feeling the country slipping away from them, and fear of the other, racial overtones, don't like immigrants, and so on. I mean, it all comes together, but they're not even necessarily the median Republican voter, right? I mean, in a non-primary context, much less the median voter in the United States.
I think there's something else going on, going way back. I actually used a quote from David in my book. I cherry pick what I like about David's ideas, and
We all.
you know, of
That's
course,
that's what everybody
that's
does.
what we all
It's
do.
okay.
But you said something like, right, the greatest generation was the statist generation. And yet, and what I tried to argue in my book is, I don't think, not to talk down to people, but I don't think that it was commonly understood how much the great middle class of the last middle century was created by a series of government decisions. And so, to the extent that it was good and fair decisions were made, and now these other decisions are being made to help those people who don't deserve it as much. And I feel like there's a lack of understanding of the role government played in creating their great good fortune that they recall, or their parents or their grandparents. Lack of understanding, and then because of the lack of understanding, a profound pessimism about what government can do besides let's hold on to Medicare and Social Security and try to keep these other people away from what we have. So it's the Republican Party, not just on race but on government, has kind of contributed to this misunderstanding of what government did, how it helped, how much it helped, and then what it can do. And so I feel like there's a lot in David's piece that I agree with, and yet some of the consequences are really frightening, because when you say a class for itself, it's a white class for its white self, and there's very little effort being made to get beyond that, at least in this primary. Presumably, the guy who comes out on the Republican side is going to talk a little bit differently when he faces a Democrat. But I don't know how much differently. I don't know how much room there is to move back to the center when you've gone as far as they've gone to the right, racially and culturally, not economically.
Well, isn't part of your point, David, that the Republican Party elites don't really have an understanding of where the middle is anyway?
Right.
I mean, so how can they move toward it?
Right.
You
Right.
know?
Well, this is why, okay, it's getting a little late to say this, but early on in the process, I thought that Trump was a salutary factor for Republican politics. He's like a tremendously destructive storm, but that knocked down a lot of ugly buildings. And, you know, sad the buildings are knocked down, but now at least you can build some better buildings. So the Republican voter does intuit what you say. I mean, they wouldn't articulate it. I mean, they might not know the names of all the programs, but if you're 63 and not as well off as you were at 48, and certainly not as well off as you sort of remember that you went to a state university that was much less expensive, even in relative terms, than state universities are now. You know that it used to be easier to get to work than it is today. You know that your parents had pensions that seem more stable and predictable and reliable than whatever you've got. And you know that although the charts show that we're spending more and more and more on health care, you're not sure that your health is going to be better than your parents. In fact, there's a lot of evidence you may not live as long, and you may not certainly be as healthy on the way there as your parents were, especially if your parents didn't smoke and you also don't smoke. So that's there. One of the things that has been so galvanizing to the Republican world is the shocking discovery among Republican elites that the ideology that the party is committed to is not the ideology that the members believed in.
I mean, that's the question I wanted to ask, which is for the last couple of years, until this election cycle, we were told the Republicans are libertarian. And they were definitely not acting as libertarians in this debate, right? I mean, the presiding theory of the House Republican caucus, of many people in the Washington establishment, was that the country itself is libertarian.
I would occasionally, you'd hear that a lot, and I would read that and think, okay, I understand why people write it, but I can't imagine there's anyone dumb enough to believe it. But apparently there were. I mean, remember that Robert Draper article on the libertarian moment, where he's like,
That's
how
how we
Oldie but
started
goodie.
this whole thing.
Draper's a really smart and good reporter. How could he possibly?
I mean, Rand
Right.
Paul
believe
was
that.
made the cover of Time magazine
Right.
multiple
The most
times.
interesting politician.
By the way, I wrote an article in April of 2015 saying Rand Paul is going to crumple and Ted Cruz is going to emerge as the most important force on the right. And that's I make so many bad predictions that when I get a good one, I like
Right.
because it just wasn't
We
true.
won't pundit fact you.
Because there's this fantastic book on the Tea Party by a woman who's I always quote but never pronounce her name correctly, Theda Sackball at Harvard.
Skocpol.
Skocpol.
Skocpol. I'm so sorry, because I use her so much, I should learn how to pronounce her name properly. But she and her team went out and interviewed dozens of people at Tea Party rallies. I'd had this experience as an individual. I was never sure, though, that my reporting was scientific, but she did it in a much more scientific way.
Really
They were overwhelmingly concerned with in whose interest did government operate? Did it operate in accordance with their moral ideas? Whether it was bigger or smaller was completely abstract and unimportant to them.
Yeah.
What mattered was that its activities aligned with their sense of what was right. Medicare and Social Security did, unemployment insurance much less so, things like disability and food stamps less still. And they had a moral economy of the state. And a party needs to know that about its members, even if it disagrees with its members' ideas of what the moral economy is. The party leaders need to know that, and the Republican Party leaders did not, and Trump is forcing them in a very destructive way. To say our voters aren't the people we thought they were. We believe too much of our own ideology, our own publicity. Their needs are different. If we're going to keep them, and then if we are, as a party organization in competition with another party organization, to mobilize their convictions and apply them in ways that are constructive, or if not constructive, at least successful, then we need better information, and we need to meet the needs of our people better than we've done.
Or go find different people, but you know.
Right. Well, or you can say, you know what? This is the advice I give to Republican audiences. If you want to run on the Ryan platform, you're going to need different voters, and that means. But then your question, because the Karl Rove question was, why didn't a Guatemalan gardener earning $27,000 a year vote for the Ryan plan? And if you find that mysterious. But here's a question. Why doesn't the lesbian partner in an accounting firm earning $300,000 a year, why doesn't she vote for the Ryan plan?
Yeah.
You could talk her into that. Why doesn't an Indian American who owns a chain of hotels, why doesn't he vote for the Ryan plan?
I mean, Indian Americans is a good example. Indian Americans are 90%, have 90% voted for Obama, and second highest African Americans, and have an income rate which is much higher than whites, right? Because they saw dignity, I mean, in my view, they saw dignity issues offended by birtherism and other things.
Right.
So it's
So
really,
you either need a new platform,
yeah.
or you need new voters. And
Their underlying attitudes toward government are actually quite positive, which makes them a pretty hard sell for libertarians. I mean, if
Wait,
you look
who's
at basic
underlying
public
it?
opinion data
Who are you
on some of
talking
these
about?
Asian American
Oh,
groups,
okay.
Yes.
they're some of the most pro-government
I'm not talking about
groups in the United States.
Look, libertarianism is an ideology for 3% of the population, very few of them over the age of 25. But the question is a more generic pro-enterprise, pro-business, low tax, minimal regulation, the kind of politics of the British conservatives and the Canadian conservatives and the Australian liberals. Those parties have shown the way, that they are less socially conservative, they are more multi-ethnic, especially the Canadian conservatives, and they have more of an upmarket coalition. So you can do that. Or what you can do is you can be like the German Christian Democrats and say, you know, we're going to be not such an upmarket coalition, and then we're going to talk about mothers' allowances and
more statist.
and
They're
more
more
statist,
statist.
more agricultural. You can do that, but you have to bring your people and your ideas into greater alignment.
Yeah.
And just to push on this point, why do you think libertarians, we'll go to questions in 1 second, but why do you think libertarianism has been this dominant theory for so long? Is it, I mean, the accusation that's made is that it's a product of the interests of the donor class. Do you think that's...
Doctrinaire libertarianism? Doctrinaire libertarianism...
or the Paul Ryan budget, like why have that been...
Well, they're different things. So doctrinaire libertarianism is just something, there's a substantial infrastructure of libertarianism in Washington, D.C., Cato Institute, and a lot of smart people. So it's very possible if you live in Washington, D.C., to believe this is an important political force in the country, because it's an important political force in Washington. And it takes just one person with a checkbook to sustain that infrastructure and to create an impression that is highly unrealistic. And even if you're not a doctrinaire libertarian, a lot of the things that libertarians are saying are more or less appealing to the kinds of people who cover politics. That's why Time magazine could profile Rand Paul, and like his views on foreign intervention, like his views on drugs, like his views on crime, not understand his views on monetary policy and why actually they're absolutely central to his politics. It sounds sort of congenial, and it looks big. But why does the Ryan? The Ryan plan is a logical, consistent answer to the fiscal problems in the United States. It's in the interest of certain groups of people, not in the interest of others. And the Republican challenge was that many of the people in whose interests it is are outside the party, and many of the people whose interests it is not are inside the party. Now, the Sanders and Trump together may bring about a realignment. We may see, in 2008, here's a data point. In 1988, among whites with a college degree, the elder Bush beat Dukakis by more than 20 points. Uri knows all these facts better than I do. In 2008, John McCain beat Barack Obama among that group by, I think, 1 or 2 points, and outside the South, he lost it altogether. So we've seen this huge migration of the college-educated into the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
That could change. That doesn't have to be true forever. I mean, you could see a party of the Democrats emerge under Bernie Sanders as a party of economic protest, and a Republican Party that emerges as the party of the people who are the winners from economic globalization. That could happen. That happens in a lot of other developed countries. And they could then, the Trump voters could be more instead of being the Republican base, they could be the contested ground over which elections are fought. That could emerge. But that's not where we are right now. What we are right now is that the most loyal Republican voters are precisely those most disaffected from the party's message.
Great. Did you want to say anything in response to that point, or?
No, I mean, I just think David's point is very well taken, that, the Republicans are simultaneously trying to be a social conservative, kind of European-style party in some ways, and a right populist party at the same time, and it really does not compute. It really just doesn't work. So I guess you'd have to say that in terms of this particular set of contradictions, the Republican Party is more affected by them than the Democrats, but I think this is what you're getting at. The Democrats themselves are potentially prey to these contradictions, as we're seeing, I think, in the Sanders-Clinton sort of contretemps. Yeah, I mean, Democrats they haven't produced either in terms of allaying people's fears about the economic future, and there's, huge debates about basically.
And allaying white people's fears about the economic future.
Right, yeah, and the Democrats, I mean, this is, I'll read it about in the Path to 270. The Democrats don't need to do that well among white voters, particularly white working class voters, but if they do really badly, even relative to even bad, previous performance, they're definitely in trouble.
Right.
If they slip back to the levels of 2014, for example, that congressional Democrats had, the election becomes almost a toss-up.
I guess the question
So-
is, it just depends on in a general election, some of the issues are, do you stratify on college education, right? So does a heavily polarized Republican debate move more college-educated voters to the Democrats, or not? And then,
Or does it move more college-educated voters toward the Democrats, but then you lose a
even
lot
more.
of
Even
white
more
working
white
class
working
people
class.
on the other side,
Yeah.
because the Republicans adopt a strenuous populist, or maybe the candidate is Donald Trump. So think about that.
She laughs.
Okay, great. We have questions in the audience, and just identify yourself. Person way over in the corner, and we really try to make them questions, brief questions.
Okay, John Cummings. Where I think a point you're missing, or I didn't hear elaborated enough, was that I don't think this is about issues at all. I think it is an anti-career politician, and that's why I think Hillary Clinton is struggling, why Bush is struggling, why people pushing Rubio, the more endorsements he gets, the worse he's going to do. How much of this do you think has sort of a anti-career politician base?
So that's great. I think I'll push on that question is are people anti-career politician also in part because career politicians aren't producing economically for folks? So do you?
Yeah, well, that's kind of my view. I mean, I think that people are not like programmed to just hate the establishment because they're just like they like outsiders. It's these feelings well up when people aren't producing, when politicians aren't producing, when they run on different platforms and they get in, and the underlying trends do not change. Again, I'll go back to my thought experiment. If we were running in America in the last 10 or 15 years where upward mobility was much stronger, economic growth was stronger, it was somewhat more equally distributed, and people had a sense of optimism about the future, we'd see a very different thing where they didn't want to just throw all the rascals out, because people are pessimistic, particularly the kind of people we've been talking about, and feel like not only have things been bad, but they seem only likely to get worse.
they don't
Because
have
the
a
same
path to
people who are
better.
in charge, who are incompetent and stupid, and by God, Donald Trump, he understands that. He'll get her done, I think that's key.
In 1959, the German Christian Democrats under Konrad Adenauer sought a fourth consecutive term in office. Konrad Adenauer at that point was 83 years old. And there are some gentle suggestions that at age 83, it might be unwise to seek a fourth term. And the German Christian Democrats ran a campaign under the slogan, "No experiments." And when you had presided over the 10 best years in German history out of the past 1,000, that worked. And they proceeded to win the biggest landslide ever recorded in German democratic history. They got an absolute majority, something that never happened before or since. Konrad Adenauer had taken a country that was rubble and delivered houses, cars, and vacations. And people were very glad. And he had been nothing through his life but a politician. He delivered success. As John said under her breath, Bernie Sanders is a career politician. And he's probably been elected to more things more often than Hillary Clinton has.
Right. Didn't he get elected dog catcher at one point in Burlington? Didn't that happen? Yeah, no, he's definitely been around.
Over here.
Thanks. Peggy Ochowski. I'm the congressional correspondent for the Hispanic Outlook. And I write a lot about immigration. I just published a book called The Law That Changed the Face of America about the 1965 Act. I'm a lifetime Democrat, and I've been involved in immigration all my life. I think Democrats and the Center for American Progress particularly are looking at immigration way too narrowly when you just focus on racial issues. I mean, immigration's about jobs. And the jurisdiction for immigration was always in the Labor Committee before, after the war, when it went into the Justice Department, into the Judiciary Committee. But immigration's not about civil rights. It's about jobs. And I'm asking you, why do you focus just on racial aspects of immigration? It really has almost nothing to do with it. Immigrants come here for jobs. Nation states want them for jobs. Immigration policy, and this is where Canada is really quite so different, that they base all their immigration based on job needs in the country and who they want to fill those jobs. And I just think you put on a completely other basis when you just focus on fear of the other.
Yeah, so I think I'm actually particularly proud of the work we've done on immigration to focus on the economic impact of immigration over long term. So, we did a series of studies a few years ago on immigration and its positive economic impact. So we definitely recognize that a lot of people, particularly immigrants, look at immigration policy as, and I think you see this on the Democratic side, looking at the Republican debate, in which we are having higher turnout amongst Latinos. There are groups of people in the United States, whether they're Asians or Latinos, who see immigration policy as a kind of signal on their dignity interests. But that I totally recognize that the broader public should look at the economic impacts of immigration policies. Now, it's our profound economic evaluation that immigration tends to be a positive to our country over long term. One of the big reasons why the United States is not likely to have the growth pattern of Northern Europe or Japan is because we have the ability to attract immigrants into our country. We could have different sets of policies around immigration, for sure. We could have a sane set of policies around immigration rather than no policies in some ways. But I think I take issue with the way you see all of our work. Over there.
Thank you. My name is Walter Tejada. I'm from Virginia. And to the point made earlier about Trump's views have a tinge of, well, not really a tinge, really, actually. It's based on racial undertones and immigration consequences and so on. And since this is what is the anti-establishment revolt really about within the GOP, it's also fair to say there's a healthy the difference within Democrats as well. Depends where you sit.
For sure.
And certainly I can say that within the Latino community, it most certainly is seen as a bias at minimum against Latinos, or against immigrants, and the way Trump has expressed his views and seems racial. So I would say my point then, my question for you, will anyone can answer that, is talked a lot of focus on the white working class, on the reaction and the populism, the popularity perhaps that some might see Trump is getting. And too many times when you see polls, for instance, that he's getting 30%, that means he's not getting 70%, and that's just within the Republican Party. I mean, certainly I'll tell you that the Democrats is probably 0%, or who knows, maybe there might be some.
I didn't want to push you towards a question.
Sure. And so my question is, what about black working class? What about brown working class? What about the single mom who's part of the working class? Mm-hmm. And many of the polls indicate that overwhelmingly against Trump and his views.
Yeah, so that's a great question, which is to go to your that experiment, Rui, about where we'd be otherwise. What do you say to those who say that people who that the economic concerns are very similar amongst African Americans, Latinos, and white working class voters, but they are hugely polarizing in this race.
Right. Well, Latino working class folks, you can see why they wouldn't be too enthusiastic about an immigration-led view of the economic problems of the working class. That's not really going to fly with them. Black working class folks are actually, they tend to be not that crazy about immigration in many ways, but any sentiments they have about that are completely overwhelmed by their sense that the Republican Party is not on their side, has racial tinges to it, which someone like Trump doesn't take away, and they're fundamentally very positive about, this gets back to the, who actually promotes government programs and who does not. I don't think Trump's sort of underlying support for social programs, at least in the social insurance sense, really gets through to black working class voters. What they hear is this guy, he just wants to blow it up, and he's kind of racist, and they just don't feel about the world the way that your median white working class conservative populist voter might feel. They're just coming out of a different space. So even though they have severe economic problems, their go-to part of the political landscape is still going to be the Democrats. Though,
Right.
You might argue maybe Sanders can break through with these voters. We'll see. But I mean, certainly that's Sanders' hope. But I think they're more likely to go for a more standard left economic populism than this sort of strange brew that Trump has brought to our politics.
Yeah, and I think the other, obviously we're talking about the white working class because we're talking about David's article, which is about the Republican base. But I also think that you see that that polls show that is the group that African American and Latino voters tend to express more optimism about the future. They have problems, but they think things are getting better and that they will still be better for their kids. That has been reversed in the white working class, and that's something of profound concern.
And if you look at the statistics, it's because things have improved over,
Right.
For Latinos and African Americans relative. Now it was like relative.
And they see government as having been an agent that's helped make that happen. So this is just a really different point of
But
view.
the past decade has been the worst decade economically for Black America since the coming of the Civil Rights era. I wrote an article that didn't get as much attention about the problems facing the Democratic Party that just made this point that it's been a calamity, a series of calamities. And I'm not going to have all of these numbers at my fingertips, but all the gains in Black wealth relative to whites that have occurred since the Civil Rights era gone.
Well, that was the banking.
That was the bank. Well, yeah.
mess.
I'm not saying that Barack Obama came into their house and took the money out of their ATMs, but
Thank you for clarifying that.
but no, they've been. But,
That's somebody else in the party.
but I'm just where Black America was in 2007, where it is in 2016. It's the worst decade since. And actually, even the 50s were a pretty good decade economically. Black Democrats may be ready to do something. I don't know what it is, but to jump one way or to jump another way.
Yeah, so I think the point I'm making is that if you look from 2013, from 1970 to 2013, which again, you can pick any year, and you take white working class voters versus black working class voters, relative experience of, or from 1980 on, relative experience of one group has declined, the relative experience of another has improved. But I take your point that the Great Recession did a huge whammy, both on Latino and African American in terms of wealth. Like wealth impacts were huge and fundamental.
Because the only wealth they had was in their homes.
And but with blacks, there's also been an employment impact. There has not been with Latinos. So and black youth unemployment, I think I'm now going to forget the number, but it's astonishing. And the gap between prime age men, black and white, which had been their likelihood to be in work, which had been narrowing through the narrowed fast in the 90s and remained sort of steady through the 2000s. That has widened again. So blacks have seen an employment effect as well as a wealth effect. One more sentence, and this is maybe too speculative, but we've had a very static pattern to American politics since the early 90s, maybe since 1994. The same groups dominate the same parties. The parties the Republican Party of 2014 looked a lot like the Republican Party of 1994. Ditto for the opposite for the Democrats. That's not normally, and the experience of American politics is you go through these long periods of stasis, and then you have these convulsive
Yeah, big disruptions.
changes. And Trump, certainly on the Republican side, indicates that moment has arrived. But it would be very strange to me if convulsive change came on one side of the ledger and nothing happened on the other.
No, I mean, there's definitely convulsive change. We just don't, it's just a question of what level of convulsive change there is on the Democratic side. I mean, if you look at numbers of wanting an anti-establishment candidate, on the Republican side, it's 70%. On the Democratic side, it's like 35%, which might be a function of having the presidency, et cetera. 35% is still a lot of people.
Right.
Considering you've had a Democratic president for 7 years, that's not a joke or something. It's just not 70%, which is what we're seeing on the other side. I think we have one last question. Time for one last question. Why don't we try and go in the back there? Nice to have. And just identify yourself.
Good morning. My name is David Whetstone, and thank you all, panel. This feels anticlimactic, but I'll go ahead. So we're looking at leadership. You made allusions to it earlier. Why not a more, I'm going to freight this question, more genuine, integral, white populist on the Republican side, as opposed to what seems to be top-down, in the Weberian sense, singularly charismatic individuals? Why hasn't this arrived? Is it working in the fish tank of media, or are there some other factors, especially a leader that can appeal across diverse lines?
So is what you're asking why isn't there some sort of more regular person kind of white populist within the Republican Party, kind of a tough, from the streets, bottom-up kind of person, as opposed to Donald Trump, I think we could fairly say is not from the streets? Well, that's a good
Avenue
question.
is a street.
All streets matter.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little...
All streets matter.
I mean, is there an explanation better than just, well, one explanation could be the media thing. I mean, who's likely to be able to leverage this energy? I mean, someone who's already famous. So that fits. Is part of it, I mean, part of it could be that people like the idea, this peculiar thing about money in politics. He's got so much money, he can't be bought. People like that. I don't know, but I mean, and maybe there just aren't any. I mean, where are the authentic, working class white populist leaders within the Republican Party? They're just
We haven't had
market
too many.
failure.
Well, let me throw an idea at you. This is going to come, probably they're not in this room, a lot of people who were regular watchers of The Apprentice. I certainly was not.
No.
But, so it's, we see Donald Trump as a force of disruption, a not personally undisciplined candidate, someone who doesn't seem to have a plan when he goes on the stage, who does wild things and who looks disruptive and who also steps on his own message in all kinds of ways that are ineffective. And it's just, he's a great TV personality, but he doesn't have any kind of organization. And we say, this guy's a joker. But if you've been watching not MSNBC, but NBC, and as millions and millions of people do, and you've been doing it for the past decade, what you've seen every week is the most commanding, decisive, effective, and caring team leader in America. Somebody who builds a successful organization. That's the part he has been playing on TV. But he's not an actor, right? I mean, yes, if it were a drama and there were that character, no one would vote for the actor who played that character. They would understand that. But TV is saying, this is who he really is, America, and his name is on all these buildings. It looks true. So for a lot of people, he's not a disruptive pop. For a lot of people, he is Dwight Eisenhower.
Oh my Lord.
That
No, but
hurts.
for a lot of people, he's the guy who knows how to take
right.
the organization and run it and make it do things. And yeah, he's a little foul-mouthed. That's not good. But if you saw Byron York's report in the Examiner this morning, a lot of the people who are voting for him, they don't like the way he talks. They wish he were more presidential.
And he just repeated, he's like, I'm not going to say that anymore. Like,
But-
he clearly went into South Carolina and was like, I'm not going to do
For
that.
many people, he represents a vision of governmental, of organizational competence that has been lost from the rest of society. And you may have a different view, but they're your fellow citizens.
Right.
I think that is a great way to end this fascinating panel. Maybe we'll come back. We'll come back in a few months. when we know the nominees of both parties. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.